starting with number 1 Brewster Buffalo, United States, Finland 1939. The Brewster Buffalo entered service with genuine promise, adopted by the U.S. Navy and exported across Allied air forces as a frontline fighter. But when the Pacific War erupted, the aircraft's fatal shortcomings became impossible to ignore. Underpowered, overweight, and sluggish in a climb, it was outclassed in every engagement against the Mitsubishi Zero. British and Dutch pilots flying Buffaloes over Malaya and Burma were massacred. Of 60 Buffaloes deployed in the defense of Malaya, the vast majority were destroyed within weeks. Pilots described it as flying a barrel, unresponsive, slow to recover, and structurally prone to failure under combat stress. The aircraft that was supposed to hold the line simply collapsed under the weight of its own deficiencies. 2. Heinkel He-162 Volksjäger, Germany, 1945. Germany's desperation in the final months of the Second World War produced one of the most dangerous aircraft ever handed to a pilot. The He-162 Volksjäger was designed in an almost incomprehensible 90 days, built using semi-skilled labor and concentration camp workers, and constructed with wood bonded by acid-based glue that deteriorated rapidly in moisture. Its BMW 003 jet engine sat mounted above the fuselage, creating a catastrophic tendency to flame out or throw debris into the tail. Pilots reported that the aircraft would simply depart controlled flight without warning. At least a dozen were lost to structural failure or accidents during the brief operational period. The Luftwaffe was handing teenage pilots a machine that was, in the most literal sense, unfinished. 3. Polikarpov I-153, Soviet Union, 1939. The I-153 arrived at a moment when biplane fighters had already been rendered obsolete by aerodynamic reality. Yet Soviet doctrine refused to accept this truth. Introduced during the Winter War against Finland and operating through the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa, the I-153 was met by Messerschmitt Me F-109s with devastating results. Its retractable undercarriage, considered an innovation for a biplane, could not compensate for fundamental speed and structural limitations. Pilots flying I-153s against German fighters faced kill ratios that bordered on the grotesque. The aircraft wasn't merely outclassed. It represented an institutional failure to understand the direction of aerial warfare, and the men inside them paid for that failure with their lives. 4. Blackburn Rock, United Kingdom, 1939. Britain's Blackburn Rock was built around a concept that seemed logical on paper and proved suicidal in practice. Its primary armament, a 4-gun Boulton-Paul turret mounted behind the pilot, was intended to allow the aircraft to attack bombers from below or the flank without needing to point directly at the target. What this design produced was an aircraft so aerodynamically compromised by the turret's drag and weight that it could barely reach 194 miles per hour. Enemy fighters encountered it with virtual impunity. The Rock was withdrawn from frontline operations within months of the war's beginning, having scored almost no meaningful combat results. It stands as one of the clearest examples of a weapon system that solved a problem no one actually had. 5. Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, United States, 1943. The Helldiver arrived under enormous institutional pressure after years of troubled development, and the U.S. Navy's crews never fully forgave it. Designed to replace the beloved SBD Dauntless as a carrier-based dive bomber, the SB-2C suffered from instability in dives, weak tail structures, and a persistent tendency to ground loop on carrier landings. Early production variants recorded accident rates that alarmed naval aviators. Pilots nicknamed it the Beast, and not affectionately. The name referred to its handling, its unforgiving stall characteristics, and a structural deficiency that caused tail failures during the high-stress pullouts that defined dive bombing. Despite eventually being refined into a serviceable platform, the Helldiver's reputation never recovered from the blood it spilled during its introduction. 6. Ferry Battle, United Kingdom, 1937. When the ferry battle flew into combat over France and Belgium in May 1940, the results were among the most catastrophic in RAF history. A single-engine light bomber powered by the same Merlin engine that drove the Spitfire, it was nonetheless so heavy and so slow that German flak batteries and Bf-109 escorts cut through formations with appalling efficiency. On May 12, 1940, 5 battles were dispatched to destroy bridges at Maastricht. None returned. The crews knew the odds and flew anyway. The aircraft's glazed greenhouse canopy gave pilots excellent visibility of exactly how surrounded and defenseless they were. Losses across the French campaign exceeded 50%. The battle wasn't a warplane by that point. It was a sentence. 7. Mitsubishi A6M0, Japan 1940. The Zero is remembered as a masterpiece of early Pacific air combat, and in 1940 and 1941, that reputation was entirely earned. But the engineering philosophy that made it lethal also made it a death trap as the war evolved. To achieve extraordinary range and maneuverability, Mitsubishi's engineers eliminated pilot armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural reinforcement. The Zero could outfly almost anything in the early war, but a single burst of .50 caliber fire could send it into flames. American pilots eventually learned this, and once the Hellcat and Corsair arrived, Zero pilots had nowhere to hide. The aircraft that had seemed invincible became a funeral pyre for Japan's most experienced aviators, men who could not be replaced, in a machine that offered them nothing in return for their sacrifice. 8. Bell P-39 Airacobra, United States, 1941. The P-39 Airacobra was an engineering curiosity that placed its Allison engine behind the pilot and drove the propeller through a long shaft, an arrangement that was innovative in conception and punishing in practice. Without a supercharger, the aircraft performance collapsed above 15,000 feet, rendering it largely useless as a high-altitude interceptor despite being marketed as one. American and British pilots in the early Pacific and North African campaigns found themselves unable to compete with opponents who simply climbed above the Airacobra's effective ceiling. Its tendency to enter unrecoverable flat spins killed an unknown but significant number of pilots in training alone. The aircraft found its best use in Soviet hands at lower altitudes on the Eastern Front, a tacit admission by everyone else that the P-39 had been deployed in the wrong war. 9. Lavochkinlag 3, Soviet Union, 1941. Soviet pilots had a name for the Lag 3 that required no translation to understand. Lakarovany Garantirovany Grob, the varnished guaranteed coffin, built from composite wood material called Delta in an attempt to conserve aluminum. The aircraft was structurally sound but aerodynamically compromised, underpowered by its Klimov engine, and almost impossible to fly with precision in combat conditions. During the catastrophic early months of Barbarossa, Lag 3 pilots faced Bf-109s with a machine that could not energy fight, could not turn fight effectively, and could not disengage at will. Losses were extraordinary. It was only through the rapid development of the La-5, using the same basic airframe with a radial engine, that Soviet designers finally transformed the lineage into something survivable. 10. Douglas TBD Devastator, United States, 1937. The Devastator was already obsolete when it arrived at the Battle of Midway, and the men who flew it into that engagement understood what they were being asked to do. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying TBDs without fighter escort against the Japanese carrier force on June 4, 1942, was annihilated. Of 15 aircraft that attacked, none survived. The squadron lost every pilot except Ensign George Gay, who survived in the water and watched the battle unfold around him. The Devastator's 115-knot torpedo run speed required it to fly straight and low, directly into massed anti-aircraft fire and Zero fighters, while the torpedoes themselves frequently malfunctioned on impact. The aircraft sacrifice at Midway was not entirely in vain. It drew the Zeros to low altitude at the precise moment American dive bombers arrived above. But the cost was absolute. 11. Focke-Wulf FW-189 Uhu, Germany 1940. The FW-189 was not a fighter, but its crews found themselves in a fighter's nightmare with monotonous regularity. A twin-boom reconnaissance and close support aircraft operating over the Eastern Front, the Uhu's distinctive twin-tail design made it instantly identifiable, which also made it a priority target. Its defensive armament was light, and while its twin-engine configuration gave it some resilience, it had no business surviving the kind of Soviet interception it routinely faced. Crews flying tactical reconnaissance over the front lines were exposed to both ground fire and aerial attack with minimal protection. The aircraft's value as an observation platform was genuine, but the life expectancy of crews assigned to low-altitude reconnaissance missions made FW-189 duty one of the more quietly terrifying assignments in the Luftwaffe. 12. Hawker Typhoon, United Kingdom, 1941. The Typhoon entered RAF service under a cloud of mechanical catastrophe that nearly ended the program before it could fulfill any purpose. Its Napier Sabre engine was chronically unreliable in early variants, prone to glycol leaks and spontaneous seizure. More critically, a structural weakness in the tail assembly caused it to shed its entire rear fuselage in high-speed dives, killing pilots with no warning and no possibility of recovery. Early Typhoon losses to mechanical failure and structural collapse rivaled those in combat. The aircraft survived its troubled introduction only because it eventually proved devastatingly effective in the ground attack role, particularly during the Normandy campaign. But the airmen who flew it in 1941 and 1942 did, so knowing that the machine beneath them might kill them before the enemy had the chance. 13. Regia Re, 2000 Falco, Italy, 1942. Italy's Regia Aeronautica produced aesthetically elegant aircraft that frequently concealed structural vulnerabilities and operational limitations. The Re 2000 suffered from wing-mounted fuel tanks that lacked self-sealing protection, creating a persistent and well-documented tendency to catch fire when hit by enemy rounds. For a fighter whose role required it to engage in close combat, this was a fundamental contradiction. Italian pilots flying the Re 2000 in the Mediterranean theater faced not only the challenge of combat, but the knowledge that any penetrating hit to the wing was potentially fatal. The aircraft saw limited service and was gradually replaced, but it illustrated a pattern that haunted much of Italy's wartime aviation: beautiful engineering undermined by critical oversights that cost pilots their lives. 14. Gloucester Meteor F.1, United Kingdom, 1944. Britain's first operational jet fighter reached frontline service in 1944, and while the Meteor represented a genuine technological milestone, its early variant extracted a severe toll on its pilots. The F.1's Rolls-Royce Welland engines were unreliable and vulnerable to compressor stall, particularly during aggressive throttle movements, a technique combat demanded constantly. The aircraft had vicious asymmetric handling characteristics if one engine failed, and recovering from that scenario required exceptional skill and extraordinary luck. Early Meteor pilots were, in essence, experimental test subjects in wartime conditions. The aircraft was initially restricted from operations over occupied Europe for fear of its technology falling into German hands, which meant the men flying it were absorbing its dangers without the validation of meaningful combat. 15. Aviation AL-2 Sturmovik, Soviet Union, 1941. The Sturmovik is celebrated as one of the most produced and important ground attack aircraft of the Second World War, and that legacy is real. But the reality of flying one was considerably grimmer than the propaganda suggested. Early IL-2 variants were single-seat aircraft with no rear gunner, an oversight that German fighter pilots exploited with devastating efficiency, attacking from behind with near impunity. Losses were staggering. Soviet records suggest that early in the war, an IL-2 pilot could expect to survive approximately 11 combat missions before being killed or severely wounded. Stalin's personal directive to factories, "The Red Army needs the IL-2 like it needs air and bread," acknowledged the aircraft's value while making no mention of the river of pilots being consumed to deploy it. 16. Sukhoi Su-2, Soviet Union, 1941. While the Sturmovik absorbed most of the historical attention paid to Soviet ground attack aviation, the Su-2 light bomber operated in the same catastrophic early months of Barbarossa, with even less survivability. Lacking the armored protection that defined the IL-2, the Su-2 was soft-skinned, slow, and entirely dependent on fighter escort that the devastated Soviet air forces could rarely provide. Entire regiments were lost in days. The aircraft represented an honest tactical concept, light tactical bombing in direct support of ground forces, executed without the structural hardening the Eastern Front demanded. Crews who flew it understood that each mission over the front lines was conducted without the fundamental protection that the nature of that mission required. 17 North American B-25 Mitchell, United States, 1942. The B-25 Mitchell was a successful medium bomber in most configurations, but the skip bombing and strafing variants developed for Pacific operations placed crews in conditions of extreme and calculated danger. Flying at mast height against heavily armed Japanese shipping, B-25 crews accepted near point-blank anti-aircraft fire as an inherent feature of the mission. The aircraft's modifications, including up to 14 forward-firing .50 caliber guns to suppress enemy gunners, were innovative but could not eliminate the fundamental reality that the crew was flying a medium bomber through the most intense fire a naval vessel could produce. Losses on individual missions could be severe, and the physical and psychological strain on crews who flew repeated low-level anti-shipping strikes was documented and profound. 18 Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, Japan, 1941. The Ki-43 Hayabusa combined the same philosophical inheritance as the Zero, extreme agility achieved through the elimination of protection, with a lower performance ceiling that made it even more vulnerable as Allied aircraft improved. Japanese Army Air Force pilots flying Ki-43s over Burma, New Guinea, and China found that the aircraft's legendary maneuverability became irrelevant against opponents who had learned to use speed, altitude, and diving attacks to negate it. The lack of pilot armor and self-sealing tanks meant that a Ki-43 hit by .50 caliber fire rarely recovered. As with the Zero, the pilots who flew it were extraordinary. The aircraft was not. The Imperial Japanese Army continued deploying it in frontline roles long after its inadequacy had been established, a decision that consumed irreplaceable airmen in a machine the war had already passed by. 19 Fiat CR-42 Falco, Italy, 1940. Italy entered the Second World War deploying a biplane fighter as a frontline combat aircraft. The Fiat CR-42 Falco was arguably the finest biplane fighter ever built. Highly maneuverable, responsive, and structurally sound. It was also hopelessly obsolete the moment it encountered monoplane fighters over the Western Desert and the Balkans. RAF Hurricanes and Gladiators dispatched CR-42 formations with a consistency that constituted systematic destruction. Italian pilots in the Falco were not poorly trained. They were flying a machine whose technological era had simply ended. The tragedy was institutional. The decision to deploy it in contested airspace against modern fighters resulted in losses that no pilot skill could offset, and the men in those cockpits understood the equation with painful clarity. 20 Lockheed P-38 Lightning Early Cold Weather Variants, United States, 1942. The P-38 Lightning became one of America's most effective fighters by the war's end, but its early deployment in the European theater produced an operational disaster rooted in a specific and brutal problem. At high altitude over Germany, in winter conditions, the cockpit heating system was catastrophically inadequate. Pilots reported losing sensation in their hands at 30,000 feet, meaning they could not operate their controls effectively during the most demanding phases of combat. Compressor compressibility issues in high-speed dives added another layer of danger that early P-38 pilots could not always recover from. In the hands of pilots who understood its strengths and operated in appropriate conditions, the Lightning was lethal. In the winter skies over Europe, it was something closer to an ordeal. 21 Bristol Beaufighter, United Kingdom, 1942. The Beaufighter TFX was a formidable and aggressive aircraft that earned genuine respect from the airmen who flew it. But torpedo strike operations over defended harbors and coastal shipping lanes placed its crews in danger that bordered on the extraordinary. Flying at low level toward well-armed convoys, Beaufighter crews absorbed anti-aircraft fire from multiple vessels simultaneously while maintaining the controlled approach their weapons required. Strike wing operations off the coast of Norway recorded loss rates that were acknowledged even within the RAF to be unsustainable on a long-term basis. The aircraft itself was not the weakness, the mission profile was. The men who flew it did so with full knowledge of what the mathematics of their trade looked like. 22. Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet, Germany, 1944. The Komet was the fastest aircraft of the Second World War and one of the most dangerous machines ever placed in human hands. Powered by Walter HWK-509 rocket motor burning two hypergolic propellants, T-Stoff and C-Stoff, that ignited spontaneously on contact with each other. The Me-163 was as likely to kill its pilot on the ground as in the air. Pilots sitting in a fuel-soaked cockpit knew that any structural failure or rough landing could trigger an explosion that left nothing recoverable. The aircraft's powered flight lasted approximately 8 minutes, after which it became a glider, vulnerable to the Allied fighters it had briefly outrun. At least 9 Komet pilots were killed in accidents unrelated to combat. The aircraft shot down roughly 16 Allied aircraft. The ratio of danger to effectiveness made the Komet one of history's most honestly futile weapons. 23. Kawanishi N1KJ Shurden, Japan 1944. Japan's Shurden was perhaps the finest carrier-based fighter Japan produced during the war, but it arrived too late, in too few numbers, and with an undercarriage that became its most notorious characteristic. The N1KJ's landing gear was complex, fragile, and prone to catastrophic failure, particularly on the rough and hastily constructed airstrips of the late war Pacific. A significant percentage of Shurdens were destroyed not in combat, but during landings and takeoffs, draining Japan's diminishing pool of skilled pilots. The aircraft that could genuinely compete with the Hellcat and Corsair was being consumed by its own engineering before it ever reached engagement range. For the pilots who flew it, the Shurden represented the painful intersection of genuine capability and systemic collapse. Extraordinary potential rendered irrelevant by circumstances that began the moment the wheels touched ground. 24. Hawker Hurricane MKI Desert Operations, United Kingdom, 1941. The Hurricane had been the true workhorse of the Battle of Britain, slower than the Spitfire, but reliable, rugged, and effective against bombers. But in the Western Desert against Rommel's Afrika Korps and their supporting Bf-109F squadrons, the Hurricane's limitations became acutely dangerous. The 109F outclassed the Hurricane Mk.2 in speed, climb, and ceiling, and Luftwaffe pilots, led by experienced aces like Hans-Joachim Marseille, exploited this margin with calculated precision. RAF Hurricane pilots over the desert understood that entering combat with a free-bouncing 109F was a disadvantage that could not be overcome by tactics alone. Losses were severe, and the psychological toll of flying an aircraft you knew was outmatched was, by pilot accounts, its own distinctive burden. 25. Dornier, Do-17 Germany, 1939. The Do-17 had been nicknamed the Flying Pencil for its narrow fuselage, a design originally intended to make it fast enough to outrun fighters. By the time it flew against Britain during the Battle of Britain in 1940, that premise had been invalidated by a generation of faster interceptors. Lightly armed and incapable of absorbing significant battle damage, Do-17 crews over England faced Hurricanes and Spitfires that could close the speed gap entirely. Loss rates during the daylight bombing campaign were severe enough to force a fundamental change in Luftwaffe strategy, shifting to night operations that the aircraft was not designed for. The crews flying it knew its vulnerabilities. So did the RAF. 26. Vought F7U Cutlass, United States, 1954. The F-7U Cutlass was America's attempt to leap an entire generation of jet fighter design in a single airframe, and the consequences fell almost entirely on the men assigned to fly it. Its tailless Delta configuration and twin afterburning engines promised supersonic performance, but the engines were chronically underpowered relative to the aircraft's weight, creating a thrust deficit that made carrier operations genuinely lethal. The Cutlass had an accident rate that shocked even a service accustomed to the inherent dangers of carrier aviation. Approximately 25% of all F-7U Cutlasses built were lost in accidents. 4 test pilots were killed during development. Several fleet pilots died during carrier approaches when the underpowered engines simply could not sustain the aircraft's weight at low speed. The Navy retired it after only 4 years, an unusually rapid withdrawal that required no further explanation. If you think we missed a fighter aircraft that truly deserved the title of a flying death trap, tell us in the comments below. And for more dangerous aviation stories, failed aircraft, and forgotten wartime machines, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.